But it needs to start with the fundamental objective of a growth strategy, and that is to create and sustain good jobs in the private sector, not simply grow the number of government jobs. And let me say that again. There is no country that creates wealth through the business cycle that only grows jobs in the government sector. We must create good, sustainable jobs in the private sector. So let's stop the non-value-added, politically divisive talk about big business versus small business. There is only one economy in the United States. And while people may find that this polls well to pit big business and small business against one another, we're anxious to grow jobs. And guess what? The customers of big business are small business. The suppliers of big business are small business. Business is business. It's part of the private sector. Let's start to focus our attention really on creating the jobs. So many of the jobs, whether they are in small business, big business, or all business today, are already involved in global trade in the United States. Whether they're directly exporting, whether they're employees in the U.S. administering that work, whether they're working for a consulting company that's doing work for a company abroad, whether they're supplying products to foreign-owned companies. So much of our economy already has experience with this arena. To build jobs in the private sector, I would submit there are 4 key fulcrums that our country, our city, and our county must focus upon. First, we must focus on creating and maintaining the best framework for doing business. Why do you move jobs to a city or a region or a country? Because it has the best framework. And what do we think of as the natural advantages we have in the U.S.? We have a uniform national commercial code. It is the envy of many regions of the world. It is the reason the Eurozone has been working so hard for the last 15 years to strike down barriers between countries. Let's avoid the temptation for individual states to adopt mandates that make it difficult to cross state lines and do business. We are one economic union. It has been the genius of our country for years. Don't let this back up. Secondly, we have a real opportunity to continue to lead the world in terms of global ethics. This is a huge issue of strength when you think about where one wants to do business. You want to do business where you can depend upon the business structure. You can depend upon the decisions people make. The important work that was done when the U.S. passed its Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and all the compliance work continues to make the U.S. a real leader in risk minimization for doing business and sets the opportunity for U.S. businesses around the world to still set the standard as to how business should be done elsewhere. These are the beacons of strength in terms of setting structure correctly. We need to implement comprehensive and thoughtful financial regulatory reform. We need to stabilize our banking system, but while doing so, let's be sure we don't paralyze it. We all know the history of economics. You must have innovation, you must have capital, and then you have the opportunity to create jobs. If we so strangle the capital machine in this country through a new set of regulations that aren't market-based, we will slow down credit availability and we will inherently slow down growth beyond what we see elsewhere in the rest of the world. We need to continue to support the evolution in corporate governance. Enormous changes have taken place since 2000. I would submit to you a major sea change in terms of how companies are governed, and it's for the better in the U.S. Let's be sure that we continue that important evolution, but at the same time, let's protect against what I would call a populist approach to corporate governance. Mandatory federal access, mandatory proxy access rights, and one-fits-all government proclamations are not the way to ensure we have an effective business environment in the United States. The unintended consequences of many of the provisions which are being discussed in Washington today will reduce competitiveness and they will reduce the attractiveness of locating jobs in the U.S. Obviously, from my comments, I think you know that I don't share the conviction that many people have that government can tell business how to run itself better than business can tell it how to run itself. Second, we must ensure the international competitiveness for U.S.-based companies. This is no small item, and here I speak of taxes and trade. Let's address the tax system first. To grow jobs in the U.S., to grow American jobs and American companies, we must have access to foreign trade. This is not the 1930s. This is not the 1950s. This is the 21st century. We want a big part of that 30% of global trade, and we want a big part of the jobs that are going to be created elsewhere where we can create jobs in the U.S. to support those jobs in foreign countries. Many of the current proposals circulating in Congress today and the administration hold the promise for significantly undermining the competitiveness of U.S.-owned corporations. For instance, let me give you one example in taxes. For a U.S.-based company today, we find ourselves in a condition where we are governed by a set of regulations that are very, very different than companies in our same industries that happen to be registered elsewhere. The great majority of OECD, these are the developed nations in the world, have a very different tax system than the U.S. does. And it's called a world tax system. We have something that, we have what's called a world tax system. They have something that's called a territorial tax system. And some of you have heard the word the deferral system, which is a loophole for the U.S. The deferral system, which was put in place about 10 years ago, was put in place to help U.S. companies compete with this more advantageous set of tax codes that exist under territorial tax systems elsewhere in the world. What was passed just last week in the House, 8 provisions to strip back many of the important facilitating elements that help U.S. companies compete abroad. As a result, U.S. companies are at a fundamental disadvantage competing abroad if this bill passes the U.S. Senate. I would urge you to let your senators know that. Secondly, many people talk about the R&D tax credit in the U.S. being a major advantage. If you look at the facts, the R&D tax credit, which was passed and is passed annually here in the U.S. last week, positions us 24th among industrial countries. So the ability to innovate, to encourage strong innovation, which many of us feel is the key to good jobs in this country, we have nothing particularly special in that regard. Over the last 10 years, 27 OECD nations have reduced their corporate tax rate. The U.S. has not. And as a result, as I mentioned, we have the second highest statutory tax rate in the world, an uncompetitive international tax regime, and the 24th best R&D tax credit in the world. I would submit to you that is not a formula for competing successfully internationally. Now, U.S. jobs have been and will continue to be highly dependent upon the U.S. tax regime and whether it can be competitive. We need to think about this tax regime in the setting of the world, not simply in the setting of looking backwards in the U.S. Now on to trade and trade agreements. I hope I've already made the point successfully with you today that it's important that the United States access world trade and continue to be a leader in this regard. It's going to be even more important to us in the future. It's important that we have open markets, but the open markets must be accompanied by strong provisions to ensure we have fair trade. But to allow the discussions around fair trade to propel us to withdraw from global trade because of populist misconceptions that a job abroad takes a job away from the U.S. is simply wrong-footed. It belongs in the 1930s, not in the 21st century. We need to return to an aggressive program of thoughtful and balanced trade agreements and ensure that U.S. companies and U.S. citizens have a crack at the growth around the world. Not to do so means that every day countries besides the United States are gaining in these important developing markets. So let's get on with the South Korean and the Colombia trade agreements and not keep them on the cooler where they've been put during the last 6 months. Third, we must strengthen our educational system, and it starts by ensuring availability. Every child and every adult should have the opportunity, not the right, and I'll talk about that in a minute, to get an education. If someone chooses not to get an education, we're not going to force them to do so. But people who understand their development is important to compete in a world economy should have the opportunity to attend a top-rate educational institution. Starting with early childhood, education, continuing on to doctoral programs, and importantly, providing the retraining capability for employees, for companies which may not be successful in what is a globally competitive economy are really important. If we think what's happened here with Invest in Children, with the Cleveland Schools STEM schools, the Breakthrough Charter Schools, Case's Great Lake Institute for Energy Innovation, these are all examples of outstanding initiatives that need to be replicated and built upon. I talked about the availability of retraining. Any fast-growing economy tends to have times when individual companies are highly successful and others may not be successful. What do we do for the employees of the companies that aren't successful? That's where continuing education is so important. That's where retraining for contemporary skills is important. And any great job market is marked by that continuing retraining capability with a curriculum that is responsive to the future needs, not the jobs that were eliminated 10 years ago.